Have you ever stood in a courtroom, your heart pounding so loudly you were certain everyone could hear it, watching the one person who was supposed to protect you become a stranger right before your eyes? Have you ever felt that suffocating silence when a judge asks for a single document that could change everything? And in that moment, you realize that your entire life, everything you believed about your family, was built on lies. Let me tell you what happened to me, because this story, this painful, beautiful, devastating journey I went through, it needs to be told. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there needs to hear it as much as I needed to live through it to become who I am today. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I experienced, what I survived, and how a single moment in a courtroom on a cold Tuesday morning in November shattered and rebuilt my entire understanding of love, family, and truth. I was 28 years old when I found myself standing in that courtroom, dressed in a suit that felt like a costume, pretending to be confident when inside I was absolutely terrified, facing the man who gave me life, my father, the person I had looked up to my entire childhood, the hero who suddenly became the villain in a story I never wanted to be part of. The courtroom smelled like old wood and anxiety, that peculiar scent of legal documents and broken families that seems to permeate every inch of those spaces where people come to settle their most painful disputes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting this harsh, unforgiving glow that made everyone look tired and defeated before the proceedings even began. My lawyer, a woman in her 50s named Margaret who had kind eyes but a steel backbone, sat beside me, occasionally reaching over to pat my hand in what I knew was meant to be reassurance, but felt more like someone preparing me for an inevitable fall. Across the aisle, there he was, my father, James, looking older than I remembered, his hair grayer, his shoulders more hunched. But his eyes, those eyes I had inherited, they were still sharp, still calculating, still refusing to meet mine with anything resembling remorse or acknowledgement. The judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, hadn't arrived yet, and in that waiting period, that excruciating limbo before everything would begin, I found myself transported back to every moment that had led me here, every choice, every discovery. Every sleepless night spent wondering if I was doing the right thing or if I was about to destroy what little remained of my family forever. You see, this wasn't just a legal battle about money or property or some straightforward dispute that could be quantified in dollars and cents. This was about identity, about trust, about the fundamental question of who we are when everything we thought we knew about ourselves turns out to be a carefully constructed fiction. My hands were shaking and I kept clasping and unclasping them, trying to steady myself. Trying to remember the breathing exercises my therapist had taught me. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 7, out through the mouth for 8. But nothing could calm the storm raging inside my chest. The hurricane of emotions that threatened to burst out in that silent, sterile room where emotions were supposed to be contained, controlled, presented as evidence rather than experienced as the raw, bleeding wounds they truly were. Growing up, my father was my hero. And I know that sounds cliché. I know everyone says that about their parents before they discover their flaws. But with my father, it felt different. It felt true in a way that shaped every decision I made, every dream I chased, every version of myself I tried to become. He was a businessman, successful by all external measures, running a small but profitable consulting firm that specialized in helping family-owned businesses navigate succession planning. And the irony of that doesn't escape me now. The man who made his living advising other families how to preserve their legacies couldn't manage to preserve his own. We lived in a comfortable suburban home, nothing extravagant but certainly more than adequate, with a backyard where I spent countless hours throwing a baseball against the back fence, imagining I was in the major leagues, while my father would occasionally come out and offer tips on my form, his voice warm and encouraging, making me feel like I could accomplish anything if I just tried hard enough. My mother worked as a teacher at the local elementary school, and between her salary and my father's income, we had what everyone would call a good life. Vacations once a year, usually to the beach or maybe a national park. Dinners together most nights around our kitchen table where we would share stories about our days. My father always having some amusing anecdote about a difficult client or a business challenge he had overcome. He taught me about integrity, about the importance of keeping your word, about how a man's reputation was his most valuable asset, and he would look me straight in the eye when he said these things, his hand on my shoulder, making me believe that he lived by these principles absolutely. that he was the embodiment of everything he preached. When I was 12, I remember him taking me to his office on a Saturday, showing me around, introducing me to his employees with such obvious pride in his voice, telling them I was going to do great things someday, and those words became a mantra in my head, a responsibility I carried like a weight, constantly trying to live up to this image of greatness he had projected onto me before I even knew who I was or what I wanted. We would go fishing together sometimes, early morning trips to a nearby lake where we would sit in comfortable silence, the mist rising off the water, the world feeling peaceful and perfect and exactly as it should be, and he would occasionally offer wisdom about life, about patience, about how the best things come to those who wait, and I absorbed it all like a sponge, believing every word, trusting that my father knew the secrets to navigating this complicated world we lived in. High school came and went, and I excelled academically, driven by this desire to make him proud, to prove that his faith in me wasn't misplaced, and when I got accepted to a good university, his joy seemed genuine, his bear hug nearly crushing my ribs, his voice thick with emotion as he told me how proud he was of the man I was becoming. College was where I started to develop my own identity, where I began to question some of the beliefs I had inherited without examination. But even then, even as I was forming my own opinions and worldviews, my father remained this fixed point, this North Star that I might navigate away from occasionally, but always return to as a reference point for what it meant to be a good man. After graduation, I worked for a few years at a marketing firm, learning the ropes, making my own way, and my father seemed genuinely happy that I was building my own career rather than expecting to slide into his business. He respected independence, or so I thought. He valued self-sufficiency, or so he claimed, and I took pride in standing on my own 2 feet, proving that I could make it without his help, that the lessons he had taught me had taken root and were bearing fruit in my own life. The first crack in the foundation appeared about 6 months after my mother died, and her death itself was devastating in ways I still haven't fully processed. A sudden heart attack that took her from us without warning, without goodbyes, without any chance to say the 1,000 things I should have said when I had the time, but kept putting off because I foolishly believed we had forever. In the aftermath of her death, my father seemed to crumble in ways I had never witnessed before. The strong, confident man I had known all my life suddenly looked fragile, lost, wandering through the house they had shared for 30 years like a ghost, haunting his own life. And I tried to be there for him, tried to help him navigate his grief while dealing with my own. But there was something else happening, something beneath the grief that I couldn't quite identify at first, a nervousness, a distraction, a sense that he was worried about something beyond the loss of his life partner. One evening, about 3 months after the funeral, I stopped by his house to check on him, bringing groceries and a willingness to just sit with him if that's what he needed. And I noticed mail piled up on the kitchen counter, unopened envelopes with red stamps and urgent notices, and when I asked him about it, he waved it away dismissively, muttering something about bureaucratic nonsense and estate issues that his lawyer was handling. And I believed him because why wouldn't I? Why would I question the man who had taught me about integrity and honesty my entire life? But the seed of doubt had been planted, and over the next few months, I started noticing other things. Small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing but together began to form a pattern that I couldn't ignore. Phone calls he would take in another room, speaking in hushed tones. Documents he would quickly shuffle away when I entered his office. A general air of secrecy that felt completely at odds with the open, honest relationship I thought we had always shared. Have you ever had that feeling when you know something is wrong but you can't quite put your finger on what it is? When your intuition is screaming at you, but your rational mind keeps making excuses, keeps finding explanations that allow you to avoid confronting an uncomfortable truth? That's where I lived for months, in this liminal space between knowing and not knowing, between trust and suspicion, and it was exhausting, absolutely exhausting, to constantly be second-guessing my own perceptions, wondering if I was being paranoid or if I was finally seeing clearly for the first time in my life. The breaking point came when I received a call from my mother's sister, my Aunt Patricia, who I hadn't spoken to in several months because grief has a way of making you withdraw from everyone, even the people who want to help. She asked me if I knew about the situation with my parents' house, and I had no idea what she was talking about. What situation? What about the house? And there was this long pause on the line before she said, very carefully, very gently, that maybe I should look into my parents' financial affairs, that my mother had confided in her before she died about some concerns she had, and that Patricia thought I should know that things might not be as they appeared. I started investigating carefully at first, not wanting to tip my father off that I was looking into things, beginning with public records, property deeds, and basic financial documents that anyone could access. And what I found made my blood run cold in a way I had never experienced before. It was like discovering that the ground beneath your feet isn't solid earth, but a thin layer of ice covering an abyss you never knew existed. The house that I had grown up in, the house where my mother had died, the house that should have been owned free and clear because I distinctly remembered my parents celebrating their final mortgage payment when I was in college. That house had been refinanced not once but 3 times in the past 5 years, each time taking out more equity, each time increasing the debt burden, and the most recent refinancing had happened just 2 months before my mother's death, a massive cash-out refinance that left the house mortgaged to nearly its full value. Where had that money gone? What had my father needed hundreds of thousands of dollars for? I tried to think of reasonable explanations. Maybe he had medical expenses I didn't know about. Maybe he had made investments that would pay off later. Maybe there was something about their financial situation that I simply didn't understand because I wasn't privy to all the details. But the more I dug, the worse it got, the deeper the hole appeared to be. I found out that his business, the consulting firm he had run successfully for over 20 years, had been struggling for the past 3 years. Not just struggling, but hemorrhaging money, taking out business loans that he couldn't repay, missing payments to vendors, facing lawsuits from former clients who claimed he had breached contracts and failed to deliver promised services. How had I not known any of this? How had my mother not told me? Or had she tried to tell me in her own way through worried looks and vague comments I had dismissed as normal parental anxiety, through questions about my own financial stability that I had interpreted as just a mother's concern for her son, when maybe she was actually trying to gauge if I would be able to help, if everything fell apart? I discovered credit card debt, dozens of cards maxed out, some in his name alone, some that appeared to have my mother's name forged on the applications, and that discovery, that realization that he might have been committing fraud using my mother's identity, that felt like a betrayal so profound I couldn't breathe. I literally had to step outside and gasp for air, my chest tight, my vision swimming, the world spinning around me as I tried to reconcile this information with the image of my father that I had carried my entire life. The worst discovery came when I found documents related to my mother's life insurance policy, a policy I knew existed because they had both talked about the importance of life insurance when I was younger, how it was a responsible thing to do to protect your family, and according to the policy documents I found, the benefit should have been substantial, enough to pay off the house and provide some financial security for my father in his later years. But when I called the insurance company, pretending to be following up on a claim, they told me that the policy had been canceled 18 months before my mother's death, that my father had cashed it out for its surrender value, which was a fraction of what the death benefit would have been, which meant that when my mother died there was no insurance payout, no financial cushion, just more debt and a house that was about to be foreclosed on because my father couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. Confronting my father was both easier and harder than I expected. Easier because I had so much evidence, so many documents, so many undeniable facts that he couldn't simply wave away with his usual charm and deflections. But harder because part of me, the part that was still his son, still the boy who had looked up to him with such uncomplicated adoration, that part desperately wanted him to have a good explanation, wanted him to show me something I had missed, some piece of the puzzle that would make everything make sense and restore the world to its proper order. I called him and asked to meet at his house, and he seemed pleased, probably thinking this was just another check-in, another instance of his dutiful son making sure he was okay in his grief. And when I arrived, he offered me coffee, asked about my work, tried to engage in the kind of casual conversation we had always shared. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't pretend. I couldn't sit there and make small talk when I knew what I knew. So I cut him off mid-sentence and said we needed to talk about his finances. We needed to talk about what had been going on. The change in his expression was immediate and striking, his face going pale, his eyes widening, and then almost as quickly a mask sliding into place, that professional, confident expression he wore when dealing with difficult clients, and he said everything was fine. I didn't need to worry about his finances, but I was ready for this. I had anticipated his denial, so I pulled out the folder I had brought with me, the copies of documents I had collected, and I spread them on his kitchen table. Like evidence at a crime scene. Mortgage statements, loan applications, credit card bills, the canceled insurance policy. All of it right there in black and white. Undeniable, irrefutable. And I asked him to explain how the house was about to be foreclosed on, explain where all the money went, explain why he canceled Mom's life insurance before she died. And with each question, my voice got louder, the emotion I had been trying to control breaking through, and he just sat there, staring at the documents, his hands trembling slightly, and for a long moment he said nothing, the silence stretching between us like a chasm that could never be crossed. When he finally spoke, his words made everything worse, not better, because instead of explaining, instead of apologizing, instead of showing any remorse or taking any responsibility, he got defensive. He got angry. He accused me of not understanding how difficult it had been to keep the business afloat, how much pressure he had been under, how he had made some bad decisions but always with the intention of fixing things later, of getting back on his feet, of protecting us from knowing how bad things had gotten. And I just stared at him, incredulous, because even now, even faced with overwhelming evidence of his failures and lies, he was trying to spin it, trying to make himself the victim, trying to justify betraying my mother's trust and squandering their future, and leaving us with nothing but debt and broken promises. The process of preparing for the lawsuit consumed my life for months, and I had to hire a lawyer because this wasn't something I could navigate on my own. The legal system is complex and unforgiving and designed for professionals who understand its arcane rules and procedures, and Margaret came highly recommended by a friend who had gone through his own family legal battle. She specialized in estate disputes and elder financial abuse, and yes, that's what this was. Even though my mother was the one who had died, my father's actions constituted a form of financial abuse, taking advantage of trust and relationship to benefit himself at her expense. The first meeting with Margaret was emotionally devastating because I had to lay out everything, every piece of evidence, every timeline, every document, and saying it all out loud to a stranger, admitting that my father, my hero, had done all of these things. It made it real in a way that it hadn't been when it was just in my head. It transformed my private pain into an official legal matter, something that would be filed with the court and become part of the public record forever. Margaret was kind but direct. She explained that we had a strong case but that it would be ugly, that family disputes always are, that my father would likely fight back hard because he had everything to lose, that I needed to be prepared for a battle that would be emotionally draining and publicly humiliating, and might not even result in recovering significant assets because much of the money was already gone, spent or lost or hidden in ways that would be difficult to trace. She asked me why I wanted to do this, and it was a fair question. Because if the money was mostly gone and the process would be painful and expensive and public, what was the point? What was I hoping to achieve? And I had to think about that. I had to really examine my motivations. Was this about justice for my mother? Was it about revenge against my father? Was it about my own need to prove that I wasn't complicit in his deceptions by standing by and doing nothing? And the honest answer was that it was all of those things and more. It was about drawing a line, about saying that some betrayals are too big to ignore, that some lies are too destructive to let slide, that truth matters even when it's painful, especially when it's painful, because without truth there can be no real healing, no authentic relationships, no foundation on which to build anything lasting. We filed the lawsuit, and my father was served with papers, and I wasn't there when it happened, but I imagined his reaction. Probably shock that I had actually gone through with it, probably anger that I was airing our family's dirty laundry in public, probably fear about what the lawsuit might uncover and what consequences he might face, and part of me felt guilty because he was still my father, still the man who had raised me and loved me in his own flawed way. But I pushed that guilt down, because I kept coming back to my mother, kept thinking about her working all those years as a teacher, dealing with difficult students and demanding parents and limited budgets, coming home tired and still making dinner and still showing up for us, trusting that her husband was taking care of their financial future, believing that they were building something together that would sustain them in their old age, and she had died with none of that, died with nothing but debt and lies. And if I didn't fight for her now, who would if I didn't stand up for what she had earned and deserved? Then what did my love for her mean? What did any of it mean? The weeks leading up to the trial were a special kind of torture, because I knew that once we walked into that courtroom, there would be no pretending anymore, no maintaining appearances, no protecting the fiction of family unity. Everything would be exposed, examined, judged by strangers, and there was something viscerally wrong about that, about having a judge and lawyers and court reporters dissect the most intimate details of my family's life. But that's what the legal system requires. That's the price of seeking justice through official channels. You surrender privacy. You surrender control. You put your pain on display and hope that the truth that emerges is worth the cost of revelation. I barely slept the night before the trial, lying in bed replaying every conversation I had ever had with my father, searching for signs I should have seen earlier, moments when I could have intervened or asked better questions or refused to accept easy answers, and the guilt of that, the self-recrimination. It was almost worse than the anger at him, because at least anger was directed outward, but guilt turns inward and eats at you from the inside, whispering that you should have known. You should have done something. You should have protected your mother from this, even though rationally I knew there was nothing I could have done. She was an adult. They were married. She had chosen to trust him just as I had, and we were both betrayed by that trust. Both victims of someone who had learned to wear integrity as a costume while acting without any integrity whatsoever. Margaret called me the evening before to go over the plan one more time, reminding me to stay calm, to let her handle the legal arguments, to trust that the evidence would speak for itself. But she also warned me about the document, the one piece of evidence that we had discovered late in the discovery process that would be the linchpin of our case, and she said we had to time its revelation perfectly, that we would wait for the right moment, for my father and his lawyer to commit to their version of events, and then we would produce it, and the impact would be devastating. And I asked her what she thought would happen when the judge saw it, and she paused, and then said she thought the courtroom would go completely silent. She thought my father would realize in that moment that he had lost everything, and she thought I needed to prepare myself for that, because even though he deserved it, even though this was justice, it was still going to be hard to watch my father's world collapse in front of me. The courtroom felt smaller than I expected, more intimate, which somehow made everything worse because there was no hiding, no distance, no way to avoid the reality of what was happening. And when my father walked in with his lawyer, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who had a reputation for aggressive tactics and creative interpretations of the truth, our eyes met for just a second, and in that glance I saw so many things: anger, betrayal, sadness, maybe even love buried under all the other emotions. And then he looked away and sat down, and the distance between us, those 20 feet of courtroom space, felt like an unbridgeable gulf, like we were on opposite sides of a canyon calling to each other but unable to hear, unable to connect, separated by something more fundamental than physical space. The judge entered, we all stood, the formalities began, and I found myself focusing on small details to keep from being overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation. The way the court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, the sound of papers rustling as lawyers organized their materials, the barely audible hum of the ventilation system, anything to anchor myself in the physical present and avoid drowning in the emotional undertow that threatened to pull me under. The opening statements were surreal. Hearing Margaret lay out our case in clinical legal terms, describing my father's actions as systematic asset dissipation and fraudulent conveyance and other phrases that drained the emotional reality from what had happened, turning my family's tragedy into a legal puzzle to be solved, and then listening to my father's lawyer paint him as a victim of circumstance, a man who had made some mistakes but always with good intentions, who had been under enormous stress and dealing with business difficulties and shouldn't be judged too harshly for decisions made in crisis. And I wanted to stand up and scream that this wasn't about stress or mistakes. This was about betrayal and lies and a fundamental disregard for the woman who had loved him and trusted him with her life. The testimony began with me, and I had to take the stand and swear to tell the truth, and there was bitter irony in that oath, in promising honesty in a case about someone who had lied consistently and comprehensively. And Margaret walked me through my discovery of the financial problems, my conversations with my father, the documents I had found, and I tried to keep my voice steady, tried to present the facts clearly, but several times I had to pause and collect myself, particularly when talking about my mother, about what she had believed and what she had been denied, and I saw some people in the courtroom, observers and court staff, nodding sympathetically, and that sympathy somehow made it worse because I didn't want pity. I wanted justice. I wanted acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong, fundamentally, inexcusably wrong. My father took the stand after lunch, and watching him sit there, watching him place his hand on the Bible and swear to tell the truth, knowing what I knew about his relationship with truth, it was almost too much. I felt my hands clenching into fists, my jaw tight, every muscle in my body rigid with the effort of staying seated and silent, when what I wanted was to confront him directly, to make him look at me and admit what he had done, to hear him say that he was sorry, that he regretted it, that he understood the magnitude of his betrayal. His testimony was a masterclass in evasion and spin, admitting to financial difficulties but characterizing them as unfortunate circumstances rather than the consequences of his choices, describing the refinancing and loans as attempts to save the business and protect his family, claiming that my mother had been fully informed and supportive of his decisions, and that last claim, that lie about my mother's knowledge and consent, it made my blood boil because she wasn't here to defend herself. She wasn't here to contradict his version of events, and he knew that. He was counting on it, using her death as a shield. And the cowardice of that, the sheer despicable cowardice of hiding behind a dead woman's inability to speak, it revealed something about his character that no amount of evidence could capture. Margaret cross-examined him methodically, walking him through specific transactions, asking him to explain where money had gone, pointing out contradictions between his testimony and the documentary evidence. And I watched his confidence slowly erode, watched him become more defensive, more evasive, watched the mask slip just enough to reveal the fear underneath, the knowledge that his story wasn't holding together, that the truth was seeping through the cracks no matter how hard he tried to contain it. The afternoon wore on. More testimony, financial experts explaining the paper trail, character witnesses on both sides saying their pieces, and it all blurred together into a stream of words and exhibits and legal arguments that felt simultaneously crucial and meaningless. Crucial because it was determining the outcome of this case, but meaningless because no judge's ruling could undo what had been done, could restore my mother or my faith in family, or my ability to trust people's presentations of themselves. And then, as the day was winding down, as I was starting to think we would adjourn and continue the next morning, the judge asked a question, and in that question, in the silence that followed it, my entire life pivoted on a single point of truth that could no longer be hidden or denied or explained away. The judge looked up from the papers she had been reviewing and she said, addressing both lawyers but really focusing on my father's attorney, that she had reviewed the evidence presented, and there was something she needed to clarify, that Mr. Thompson had testified that his wife was aware of and consented to the financial decisions he made, including the refinancing of the marital home and the cashing out of the life insurance policy. Was that correct? And my father's lawyer stood and confirmed that yes, that was my father's testimony, that this had been a joint decision made by both spouses who were equally informed and equally responsible, and the judge nodded slowly and then asked if they were stating for the record that Mrs. Thompson, the deceased, was fully aware and supportive of these transactions, and again the confirmation came, confident, certain, and I saw my father nodding along, believing that his version of events was prevailing, believing that his characterization of my mother as a willing participant in his schemes would protect him from the full weight of the law's judgment. The judge turned to Margaret and asked if she had any evidence that contradicted this testimony, and Margaret stood, and I could see her taking a breath, steadying herself for what was about to happen, and she said, "Yes, Your Honor, we do. We have a document that we believe will clearly demonstrate that Mrs. Thompson not only did not consent to these transactions, but was actively opposed to them, and had taken steps to protect herself legally before her death." The courtroom, which had been filled with the ambient noise of people shifting in seats and papers rustling and quiet conversations, went absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Everyone suddenly hyper-focused on what was about to be revealed, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest because even though I knew what was coming, even though Margaret and I had discussed this document extensively, seeing it play out in real time, seeing the moment approach when everything would change, it was overwhelming. My father's lawyer objected, claiming surprise, saying that this document hadn't been properly disclosed in discovery. and Margaret calmly explained that it had been filed with the court in the supplementary evidence submission 3 days prior, that opposing counsel had been notified, that there was no procedural violation, and the judge checked her files and confirmed that yes, the document was properly submitted, and then she said the words that made time seem to stop. Present the document. Let's see what we're dealing with here. Margaret approached the bench with several copies, providing one to the judge, one to the opposing counsel, and bringing one to me, though I already knew what it contained, had already read it dozens of times, had already wept over it and raged over it and tried to understand how my mother had lived with this knowledge in her final months. And the judge began reading, her expression neutral at first but gradually shifting, her eyebrows rising slightly, her lips pressing together in what looked like controlled anger or deep concern. And I watched my father, and I saw the moment he understood what document this was, saw his face go pale, saw his hands grip the edge of the table, saw his lawyer lean over and whisper urgently to him, and his response was a barely perceptible shake of his head, a gesture of denial or despair or both. The document was a letter, dated 4 months before my mother's death, written in her own hand, addressed to a lawyer she had consulted about divorce, and in it, in her clear teacher's handwriting, she detailed her discovery of my father's financial deceptions, her feelings of betrayal and violation, her realization that the life she thought they had built together was based on lies, and her intention to legally separate from him to protect whatever assets remained in her name. She wrote about confronting him, about his promises to fix everything, about her choice to believe him one more time even though she knew she shouldn't, and she wrote about her fear that he was dragging them both toward financial ruin, that his pride and his inability to admit failure were more important to him than their security or their marriage, and she wrote, and these were the words that destroyed me when I first read them and destroyed me again hearing them read in that courtroom. I don't know who I married anymore. The man I loved, the man I trusted with my life. He either never existed or he died somewhere along the way and left this stranger in his place, and I don't know how to grieve for someone who's still alive but completely lost to me. The judge finished reading and looked up, her face grave, and she said that Mr. Thompson had testified under oath that his wife was aware of and supportive of his financial decisions. But this letter, written in her own hand just months before her death, directly contradicted that testimony. It indicated not only that she was not supportive but that she was considering divorce specifically because of these financial issues. Did he have any response to this? And my father just sat there, frozen, unable to speak, unable to mount any defense because what could he say? The letter was right there, in my mother's handwriting, dated and witnessed by the lawyer she had consulted. Undeniable evidence that his entire testimony had been a lie, that he had used his dead wife's inability to contradict him to paint a false picture of their marriage and her knowledge and consent. His lawyer tried to recover, tried to argue that the letter represented one moment of anger, that marriages have difficulties, that my mother had ultimately chosen to stay and work through their problems, but the judge cut him off, her voice sharp with barely contained disapproval, and she said that this letter was written 4 months before Mrs. Thompson's death and there was no evidence of reconciliation, no evidence that she changed her mind about the concerns she expressed here, and more importantly, his client's testimony was not that they had marital difficulties but that she was aware and supportive of his financial decisions. And this letter proved beyond any doubt that she was neither aware of the full extent nor supportive of what he was doing. In fact, she was planning to leave him because of it. The silence in that courtroom was absolute, suffocating, heavy with the weight of exposure and consequence, and I looked at my father, and he was crying, tears streaming down his face, and I didn't know if they were tears of remorse or tears of defeat or tears of self-pity. And I found that I didn't care because my mother had cried too, had cried in secret, had cried while writing that letter, had cried knowing that the man she had devoted her life to had betrayed her in the most fundamental ways possible, and her tears mattered more to me than his ever could. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The judge ruled in my favor on every major point, determined that my father had committed fraud, had breached his fiduciary duty to my mother, had lied under oath during the trial, and she ordered him to pay restitution, though we all knew there wasn't much money left to recover. The house would have to be sold, and the proceeds would go toward paying my mother's creditors and establishing a small trust in her name. My father's business assets were to be liquidated, and he would face potential criminal charges for perjury and fraud, though that would be up to the district attorney's office to pursue. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt hollow, emptied out, not victorious or satisfied, or even particularly relieved, just exhausted and sad and deeply, profoundly changed by what I had experienced. Margaret told me I had done the right thing, that my mother would be proud, that justice had been served, but I couldn't feel proud, couldn't feel like this was a victory worth celebrating, because what had I won, really? I had proven my father was a liar and a fraud. I had destroyed whatever remained of our relationship. I had aired my family's darkest secrets in a public forum. And yes, technically justice had been served. The legal system had worked as it was supposed to. But my mother was still dead. My father was still the man who had betrayed her, and I was still the son who had to live with the knowledge of all of this for the rest of my life. In the months that followed, I tried to rebuild, tried to make sense of what had happened and who I was in the aftermath of this revelation. And it wasn't easy. There were days when I questioned every decision I had made, wondered if I should have just let it go, accepted that some truths are too painful to excavate. But then I would remember that letter, my mother's words, her pain, her feeling of being trapped with someone who had become a stranger, and I knew that I had done what she couldn't do, had stood up for her when she could no longer stand for herself, had insisted that her truth mattered even if it came at great personal cost. I learned things about love and family that I wish I didn't know. Learned that love without trust is just attachment, that family without honesty is just biology, that the people we admire most can be hiding the darkest secrets, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold someone accountable even when it breaks your heart to do it. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely had betrayed that trust in ways you couldn't have imagined? Comment below and tell me your story, because I've learned that we're not alone in these experiences, that families are complicated everywhere, that trust and betrayal are universal human experiences, and sometimes just knowing that others have survived similar pain can help us feel less isolated in our own. Understanding this kind of betrayal, understanding how families can fracture and how trust can be destroyed and how we rebuild after everything falls apart, it's important, it's vital actually, because so many of us carry these secrets, these painful truths about our families that we're afraid to share, and we suffer in silence thinking we're the only ones, but we're not. We're really not. If this story touched your heart, if you felt something while listening to it, if any part of it resonated with your own experiences or fears or hopes, please leave a like. It helps me know that sharing my truth mattered, that vulnerability has value, that these difficult stories need to be told even when they're painful. And please subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales for more stories like this. Real stories, honest stories. Stories that explore the complicated reality of being human in a world where nothing is as simple as we'd like it to be, where the people we love can hurt us, where doing the right thing often costs us dearly, but where truth still matters, where integrity still counts, where we can still choose to be better than our worst moments and hold others accountable for theirs. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future stories, because I have more to share, more truths to reveal, more experiences that shaped me and might help you understand your own life better. And thank you truly for listening, for being here, for witnessing my story and maybe seeing a reflection of your own.